At 3,600 meters below the surface of the North Atlantic, a 300-foot structure was detected that should have collapsed decades ago. At this depth, steel fails under pressure gradients that no engineering was ever designed to survive. Compartments buckle, hulls surrender. The ocean forces everything toward a single, inevitable state of equilibrium, and over enough time, it finishes what physics begins. That is the rule of the deep. That is what always happens. But this structure didn't collapse. It didn't fragment into the sediment. It didn't disappear into the geological record the way everything else does. It remained, a 300-foot-long metallic form, partially buried in the seafloor, with edges still intact and geometry still visible from the ROV cameras. And that alone breaks every expectation we have about how the deep ocean works, because nothing this large survives this intact for this long. Nothing. But what made the crew stop speaking wasn't the size of the structure. It was the data coming back through the sensors. The temperature around the structure was rising, not dramatically, not enough to alarm an untrained observer, just enough to matter to someone who understands what temperature means at this depth, which means something inside that structure is still generating energy. And that creates a problem the deep ocean does not allow, because at 3,600 meters, systems do not stay active. They stabilize, they equalize, they stop. But this one hasn't stopped, and no one on board could explain why equilibrium has failed here. The sonar image repeated exactly on every pass. Same shape, same dimensions, no distortion, no signal decay, no variation between sweeps, which confirmed one critical thing. This wasn't instrument noise, and it wasn't a geological formation. This was a structure, a central hull-like mass surrounded by a ring of metallic fragments distributed outward from it, like something had exploded from that single point and pushed everything away from itself in one violent, directional moment. That image matters before anything else does, because it gives the brain something to hold, a ring, a center, a force that moved outward and then stopped. And only after you see that picture does the physics start to matter, because debris in the deep ocean follows energy dissipation. It spreads chaotically along pressure gradients and current drift. It does not organize into rings. It does not form patterns. Unless the force that created it was not symmetrical, unless something struck this structure with direction rather than randomness, and the debris field captured the exact geometry of that event and preserved it here, at depth, where almost nothing disturbs what the sediment records. Which raises the first unresolved question. What created a controlled debris field at a depth where the energy required to produce that pattern should not have existed? The ROV descent revealed something more important than the structure itself. It revealed the system surrounding it, and what that system was telling us about what had happened here. At 3,600 meters, the ocean is not a place of chaos. It is extraordinarily stable. Temperature remains nearly constant across years and decades. Currents are minimal to the point of near stagnation. Chemical gradients settle into balance so precise that scientists use deep ocean water as a baseline for measuring deviation elsewhere in the world. This stability is the defining characteristic of the deep. It is a system built to eliminate instability, to absorb anomalies, to integrate disturbances until they become indistinguishable from everything around them. Which means any disturbance down here is temporary. Any structure eventually integrates. Any anomaly disappears into the sediment, the chemistry, the biology of the deep. But this structure hasn't integrated. After what the corrosion patterns suggest is a significant period of time, it remains distinct from its environment. Something is actively resisting stabilization, and systems that resist equilibrium at this depth do not remain passive. They do not simply sit still and wait. They continue to interact with everything around them, and those interactions produce consequences that compound rather than resolve. When the ROV lights hit the hull directly, the contradiction became physical and undeniable. Flat plating, linear ribs, defined geometric edges still visible, still structured, still recognizable as engineered surfaces rather than geological forms. This is not how deep ocean wrecks behave after extended time on the seafloor. Over time, microbial systems begin consuming exposed metal at the molecular level. Rusticles form across iron-rich surfaces. Iron is broken down and redistributed into the surrounding water column. Surfaces weaken progressively until entire sections can no longer support their own weight and collapse inward under the pressure differential the ocean maintains constantly against everything inside it. But here, that collapse appears incomplete, which creates a rare and unstable condition, a structure that is no longer new, but not yet fully absorbed by the environment around it. Still holding shape where shape should have surrendered long ago. Still maintaining internal geometry where the ocean should have already erased it. And that is precisely where instability begins to compound, because partially integrated structures trap gradients between their interior and exterior environments. And wherever gradients persist, the system continues to change. The process doesn't pause. It accelerates toward an outcome that hasn't arrived yet. The breach confirms what the debris field implied, a 6-meter wide opening in the hull with edges bent inward rather than outward. Steel thick enough to resist the pressure of storms and open ocean, folded inward like thin foil. That distinction is everything, because outward bending indicates interior pressure, an explosion from within, but inward bending means external force. Something struck this hull from outside with enough energy to penetrate thick steel plating at a depth where kinetic systems barely exist. No waves reach here, no storm energy propagates to this depth, no large moving bodies of water carry momentum in the way surface conditions do. So the question is not simply what hit this structure, the deeper question is how force of that magnitude was delivered inside an environment that suppresses motion at every scale. And then there is the detail that the researchers kept returning to. The damage still looks recent. Corrosion should have softened those edges. Time should have rounded them, filled the breach with biological accumulation and sediment drift. But it hasn't. Those edges remain sharp, that opening remains defined, which suggests the system around this structure is not behaving according to the timeline it should be following, and something is keeping that wound open. Then the behavioral pattern changes, and the expedition encounters something it wasn't prepared to explain. The predators arrive. Greenland sharks, some of the slowest and longest-lived vertebrates on the planet, begin appearing in the ROV footage with a consistency that breaks statistical expectation. They move slowly and deliberately around the structure, circling at a measured distance. Not hunting, not reacting to prey, not competing with each other for position, but returning, again and again to the same radius, around the same point, as if responding to a signal that the human instruments were only partially capturing. This is not random behavior. Deep-sea predators follow signals with extraordinary precision across distances that would seem impossible in any other environment. Chemical gradients dispersed through the water column, thermal anomalies as small as fractions of a degree, electrical cues generated by biological or chemical activity nearby, which means something near this structure is producing a consistent, repeating signal strong enough to draw apex predators back repeatedly over time. And that should not be happening. A stabilized wreck becomes chemically neutral. It stops producing variation. It stops attracting attention from organisms that are responding to difference rather than presence. Unless something inside this structure is still generating that difference, still breaking equilibrium from the inside out. The temperature increase is small enough that an untrained observer might dismiss it as instrument drift, but it changes the entire framework of what we're looking at, because the deep ocean does not fluctuate at this depth in any way that a passive, stabilized object could produce. Even a minor sustained increase in localized temperature means energy input, and energy input means an ongoing process, not a historical event, not residual heat from something that happened long ago. An active, continuing process happening now, inside the structure, below the sediment layer, somewhere the ROV cameras cannot reach directly. So the system narrows to a critical decision point. Either there is an ongoing chemical reaction occurring inside, something that the specific combination of materials, water chemistry, and pressure at this depth is sustaining against all probability. Or there is something inside this structure that has not shut down, some process that continues to operate regardless of what has happened to everything around it. Both possibilities lead to the same conclusion. This system is not finished, and that returns us to the anomaly that started everything. Why, at 3,600 meters below the North Atlantic, has equilibrium failed to arrive? Inside, the structure still holds shape in ways that defy the logic of deep ocean decay. Beams remain load-bearing, compartments retain separation. Boundaries between interior spaces persist where they should have dissolved long ago into open flow. Because deep ocean systems erase interior boundaries over time, interior becomes exterior as hulls breach and pressure equalizes. Flow replaces isolation. The contained becomes the open. But here, separation still exists across multiple compartment walls that the ROV was able to observe through the primary breach. And where boundaries remain, gradients persist. And where gradients persist, the process of change continues to accelerate rather than slow, which provides context for the signal the ROV captured during its second interior pass. A faint blue luminescence contained within one of the deeper compartments, steady rather than pulsing, not drifting with water movement the way bioluminescent organisms would. Not biological, not an artifact of the ROV lighting system, which the team confirmed by switching to infrared and observing the same thermal signature in the same location. And then it disappeared, completely, between one frame and the next, which raises a more unsettling question than any the expedition had encountered to that point. Not what the light was, but why it stopped when it was observed. The tracks confirm what the sonar had already begun to suggest. Parallel grooves extending from the base of the structure along the seafloor sediment, fresh and undisturbed by the biological activity that should have smoothed them within hours of formation. Indicating displacement, the structure had moved. Not dramatically, not in any way that surface instruments would have registered, but enough that the sediment recorded it with the precision that only the deep ocean floor can maintain. Displacement requires force. Force requires energy, and sustained energy should not exist here in any form that a passive object could produce or access. Yet the sonar recorded the shift, only centimeters, but enough to break the final assumption the expedition had carried into the dive, that whatever this structure was, it had at least become still. That time had brought it, if nothing else, to physical rest. But it hasn't come to rest, and it still doesn't explain the heat, which means time is not ending this system. Time is sustaining it, and that changes the category of what we are looking at entirely. The ocean does not destroy structure. It absorbs it. It breaks it down across timescales that dwarf human civilization, rewrites it chemically into something new, integrates it so completely into the surrounding environment that the boundary between what was placed there and what was always there eventually disappears entirely. That process is not destruction, it is transformation, and it depends entirely and absolutely on equilibrium. Everything must eventually stabilize. Pressure, chemistry, biology, thermal flow. The ocean is patient in a way that nothing engineered by human hands can resist indefinitely. But here, stabilization has failed. Something inside this structure is delaying integration, holding gradients open that should have closed, sustaining difference where difference should have been absorbed, preventing the closure that the deep ocean has been working toward since the moment this structure came to rest on the seafloor. This is not a wreck. It is a system that has not finished becoming. And systems in that state do not remain unchanged. They evolve. They shift. They interact with everything around them in ways that compound rather than resolve. So the real question is no longer what this structure is, or what happened to it, or how it came to be at 3,600 meters below the North Atlantic. The question is what it is becoming. Because the ocean is not finished with it, and whatever is happening inside those compartments, behind those boundaries that should not still exist, has not stopped yet. Subscribe to Sunken Realms Deep, where lost ships are no longer history, but active systems. The ocean is still trying to understand. Because beneath the waves, nothing simply disappears. Everything becomes something else. And we are here to find out what.